of 20. It would be nice to see all of you in person, however, but of course, given the current circumstances across the globe, it's great to be able to use this technology so that we can keep compelling programming going in the light of the pandemic. Now, it is my honor to introduce a friend and colleague who is the featured speaker for this afternoon's session, and that is Bofta Yimam. Now, Bofta is a leadership speaker, a story coach, and an Emmy award winning and Edward R. Murrow award winning journalist and national TV correspondent. For more than a decade, Bofta has reported live from the morning and evening news for top TV outlets, including CBS, National News, Euronews, and BBC, from the White House and the historical 2020 election to COVID 19 responses. Now, Bofta has also covered a plethora of stories that have appeared across the country. She's a former WTAE Channel 4 Action News reporter and anchor right here in Pittsburgh. And she currently reports live weekday mornings on the Black News Channel, a national TV network, where she covers policies and legislation dominating Washington with a special focus on the impact to people of color. And Bofta is the first Ethiopian American newscaster to win an Emmy Award. And her philosophy for business and life is to uncover the golden threads that make you unique and weave them together to showcase your whole beautiful being. Bofta, thank you so much for joining us. It's a great conversation. It's so good to see you.
It's good to see you too. I was saying right before we came on, it's just like talking to a friend because you are a friend. This is so not formal, y'all. Thanks for joining. So not formal. Yeah, we're just gonna jam and have fun.
Absolutely. I mean, and we go way back, when we were both general body members of the Pittsburgh Black Media Federation, and we traveled across the pond, if you will, down to Cuba, covered some great stories down there. I mean, how about that? You know?
Yeah, I think that when I joined PBMF, the Pittsburgh Black Media Federation, I didn't realize how impactful it would be for me both personally and professionally. Not just going to Cuba, but going to Cuba with really good people, amazing journalists, talented journalists, and roughing it a little bit out there, right? I mean, we stayed in hostels. We totally didn't do it up. We were on the ground. We were carrying the cameras and going after different stories. And that is just this amazing memory that is ingrained as part of my experiences in Pittsburgh, just being part of PBMF and then moving into a board member role and helping to carry out some of the events we were doing and doing those things and lending and serving in that way. So to me, PBMF is such a pivotal part of my overall experience as an anchor and reporter in Pittsburgh.
Absolutely, and it's definitely a part of our growth and maturation as professional journalists. So, speaking of that, let's get right into our conversation. So, talk about your professional and personal journeys. You've taken, to not just telling stories, or not just telling your story, but owning it as well. Just think about that. And at what point in your career did some of those shifts happen throughout your career?
Yeah, I think that I felt this strong desire, like many people do, right, to spread, to play bigger, to embrace multidimensional, as I like to call it, gifts and talents. I think we have more than one thing we do. Even if we do one thing really well, we may have this urge to do something else. And for me, that exploration actually happened during my time in Pittsburgh. I was exploring a lot of different things about myself. I was taking workshops and different things. I was investing in my own personal development and in coaching more than I ever had before. So I just did all of these things trying to tap into other things that I felt the need that I wanted to explore. It was just this strong desire. I like to call it a pull sometimes. It's that thing in your gut where you're like, I want to try some other things too. I know I've done pretty good over here, but I don't want to limit myself and I don't want to create ceilings for myself. I want to look back on my life and know that I at least tried. And so I wanted to explore things like coaching and speaking and having high impact on a global level, and I think that that was something that I could no longer ignore in a sense, and that I had to start to reach for. Doesn't mean it was easy. It was not easy. And it's still not easy all the time, right? Definitely not. But in that spirit though, Brian, what that also encouraged me to do was to think of my own story and to think of ways that I wanted to have impact, because you just don't want to speak, right? You want to have something, really powerful to say and to relate to others, to inspire them to do whatever it is they wanted to do. And so I just started to see myself in a different light. And I saw myself speaking on stages internationally before I ever actually did so. Like I literally had a vision. And so, as cliche as it sounds, I just couldn't ignore that vision that I felt like was planted in me, through a higher calling. And so I just listened to it.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
then, and you've been, a journalist. You're still a journalist, but like you say, a life coach. Just talk about how that connection with so many people, helps them become better people as well.
Well, what I really do is help people play more visibly. So, I like to think of life coaching looks at all these different aspects of your life and dives in. I really look at how are you, as a subject matter expert, really taking what it is what you know how to do, and leveraging that and being visible with that so that you can have a higher impact. So it involves that self awareness. And it involves that desire that you also want to play bigger. And so, in that, what you connect is that fabric of what is the story that you're trying to get across in terms of who you are and what impact you want to have on the masses. And so it all connects because it's all about extracting stories. And the reality is we all have stories, but most of us don't know how to tell our story because we think of all the different layers. Oh my goodness, I've been through this, I've been through that, I've been through that, right? And we have. But I like to, and this is a quick tip for anyone looking to do the same, I like to think of what are the transformational moments? What are the moments that shaped you? Doesn't mean it was the shaping that you love, right? But it's the moment that, hey, this changed something about me, how I operate, who I am, those kinds of things. So for me, I went through some financial hardships when we were younger, when I was growing up, especially. We had ups and downs. My family, immigrants to this country, they came the late 60s and early 70s, and my parents came here for college from Ethiopia with the intention, Brian, of going back to Ethiopia.
Yep.
But due to atrocities that were happening there at that time, human rights violations, frankly, that prompted them to continue to stay. And in doing so, they ended up being this rock for other family members, migrating over to America. And so it did put, I think, quite a bit of hardship. It's something they wanted to do, but that doesn't mean it was a simple thing or an easy process, and helping people to migrate to America and then helping them get on their feet. And it just took a toll. And eventually, we went through different things where, we had the house, we had all of those things, the American dream, so to speak, but we were going through a lot of financial strain. Eventually, about a month before my 16th birthday, we lost our home to foreclosure. So then I ended up moving to a different home, and then I was playing sports. I started to lose interest in nearly everything and just fell into this really deep depression due to multiple things that were going on and a lot of instability. What that taught me, though, and it took a while for me to come through that, what that taught me, though, in that, and I think it has helped me today, just be a more empathetic person to people going through those things, both as just an individual and also as a journalist in storytelling, just seeing things through different layers, because it's usually complex.
Sure.
It's usually not one thing, right? And then you that makes you more resilient. Hopefully, you can come through that. And it did make me more resilient. It took time, definitely took time. I will never stray away from that. It was really hard because I didn't want to survive. And so going through that, though, Brian, made me resilient to then go through college and say, I'm going to pay my own way through college. I'm going to figure this out. And then go into broadcasting, having no real connections, just doing internships like so many out there and just trying to figure it out. And being a minority, entering a field that does not have, frankly, a lot of minorities. So all of those things were part of my story. And I had to really sit with those things and own that to move into the next level, I say,
Right.
of what I
And
wanted to do.
No, no, and great answer because we as journalists, we're known for doing the story and never really becoming the story. And you
Mhm.
have a very compelling story, not only as a journalist but as a motivational speaker and in leadership, have with a leadership role. And when we talk about that, when we talk about those stories, there's so many risks. That we take throughout our career, just moving about the country. You mentioned, your life going up to college and then getting into the business professionally. Would you say that there's a major risk that you took in your journalism career that really paid off, and you can go back and say, you know what, I'm glad I took that risk?
Yeah. And I know we're getting some questions, so I can't wait to get to them in the chat. So definitely a risk I think I took was just starting in broadcast and
Okay.
taking that leap. I've taken several risks when I look back, but when I was in college, I was doing those internships. But after college, I decided actually to go to Ethiopia for 6 months. Now, you're young, and I don't regret doing that at all. But of course, I knew it was going to be harder coming off of that, now having this gap in my resume and trying to enter into my broadcasting career. And I, for personal reasons, wanted to do that before I embarked on. I knew what would be, a tough career, and that you're moving quite a bit, and it's a bit difficult to take gaps later on sometimes. So I just said, this is the time. So when I came back from Ethiopia, and here I am now applying, I applied to more than 100 TV stations and just heard crickets. I mean, literally. And back then, I'm dating myself here, but you didn't send a link with your reel, your resume reel, so to speak. You took the VHS tape and you literally had to drive over to the post office and mail out each one. And that's costing you because you're just hearing nothing back. And all you are is just, the role. So I was doing that over and over. Imagine I went to the post office for more than 100 VHS tapes. So, folks, I am persistent, if anything. So I was just sending those out, hearing crickets. And so then I had to be real. Do I need more skills? I had to be honest with myself. Do I need more skills? What's missing here? And so I went and I went to go do this internship, and I'll get to that story in a second. But what I ended up doing, so the risk that did pay off, is I ended up moving to Georgia, driving 8 hours south, packing my Honda. Literally, that was it. I just had the Honda, drove down, and I was there for the next about year and a half working for an independent TV station. And that was my first opportunity. High risk also because I made minimum wage. And so I still had student loans and I still had to take care of myself. And, that was hard. And then I worked weekends at a restaurant, so that's that girl on TV. I'm like, yes, that's me. So, it was all fun, but, I was there about a year and a half, but that was a huge risk, driving to Georgia and, going to Walmart, picking up my mattress and setting up shop there and knowing no one. I knew no one in pretty much the whole state. I left all family and friends and just embarked on what would be the start of just this whole new journey in broadcasting. So definitely a risk that paid off for sure.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
we are getting some questions, and I'll get to this question in 1 second. But I do want to ask you, is there a risk that you learned from, even if it did not work in your favor?
Um, After college, when I came back from Ethiopia and I did that internship, so Brian, I was banking that, okay, if I do this internship at a small market, it's hands on, about 2 hours from where I lived at the time in Maryland, oh, I will be able to just slide into an opening when it's open. Well, the news director, so that was my game plan. So I rented an apartment for a few days each week for that summer. I mean, I was doing all those things. I was renting off a young college girl,
Wow.
and then I gotta tell you, the news director left. I almost wanted to cry because he's who I had rapport with. So I said, "Oh my goodness, I just did this internship for free after college, working side hustles on the weekend, trying to get by as I drive back and forth to Harrisburg, Virginia every week to get some hands-on learning." Because, like I said, I thought I needed more skills, and I did need more skills. I was right about that. So initially, I was like, "This is not paying off. This is not paying off." But here's a lesson I learned: you've got to do all that you can and then let the universe, as woo woo as it sounds, then do some of the work for you. Because I ended up meeting an anchor at that station. She referred me to her old boss in Georgia. That's how I ended up getting connected to that job in Georgia. So
So every
Didn't end up in Virginia, but I did end up in
to
Georgia.
help you in the long run.
You're right. And so, but I think I was putting so much action toward making this happen that it happened, but just not in the way we expect. So I think the lesson learned is you've got to trust that if you're doing everything possible, that it will work out. You just got to put all of your eggs into whatever it is you're trying to achieve. So that was definitely initially though, I was thinking, man, I've been hustling all summer and I'm watching my friends, get jobs in corporate in DC. None of them were doing broadcast. And I'm like, man, I am on the struggle bus right now. So yeah.
Oh,
Mhm.
that's fantastic. We have our first question
Okay.
from the attendees.
Awesome.
And the question is for you, Bofta. And it says, what tips do you have for adapting or tweaking your story across different audiences? And what do you reframe and what do you keep whole?
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Okay, so there's a couple of layers into that. So here's what I will start with is rather than focusing on how to tweak it for different audiences, I would actually say they will come to you based on what your truth and authenticity is. So initially, I would say, think about, like I said before, your transformational moments. What are some powerful and impactful moments that you've gone through? And then say, which audience would value this the most? I'm assuming that may be somebody who wants to maybe speak related to their story. So focus on you. How can you provide value to them? And they will come. They will come.
Fantastic. Our next question, and it's to both of us, why a broadcasting career?
Oh, that's so easy for me.
Yeah.
So easy. I love to write.
Yes.
So, of course, I'm in the TV world, you do the TV thing, but I actually would say that writing is the thing for me. And secondary or even farther down is all the TV things. It's the writing to video for me that I love. I think I've always been infatuated with documentary style things. And growing up, I remember watching a reporter be on the scene somewhere. And I think it was 60 Minutes because my parents watched 60 Minutes because they wanted some, international news sometimes. And they used to provide these compelling stories. And I remember looking at this reporter and saying, how did she get there and know all of those things and write this story, this compelling story? And I was a young kid. So I think I was attracted to it. And then, if anything, the most thing I probably focused on from a skill set is attending writing conferences and watching other great writers. Some of the best were in small markets, actually. Some of the best journalists, some of the best writers, and how they wrote to video and made the story just shine. And so for me, it's the desire to tell stories and to tell stories that I think are not talked about, the stories that often would not, um, be highlighted. And to me, and I think maybe it's also because, you know, I look at my own background and I think of, nobody was telling that story, especially then. So I think I know what that's like in so many different ways. And so for me, it's definitely the writing piece and to tell stories that would otherwise go untold.
Great answer. And now for me, and it's funny you mentioned 60 Minutes, both. I grew up watching 60 Minutes. I was a 10-year-old in the city of Pittsburgh. I'm born and raised here in Pittsburgh. And I was that 10-year-old who would be outside playing in the street and building bike ramps and we're little boys, we're throwing rocks and trying to,
Right, right, right.
do so much as kids. But at 7 p.m. on 60 Minutes, on Sunday evenings, I had to go in and watch 60 Minutes. And it was not because my parents made me do it. It was because I loved one single individual, one person on 60 Minutes who told compelling stories, and that was Ed Bradley.
I was gonna say, yeah,
He
Ed.
looked like me. He was an older gentleman. On television, he was smooth. He could turn a phrase.
Yeah.
And at that point, I used to watch him and try to emulate him,
Mhm.
at home and try to, project my voice. And then when I was in elementary school at the time, and I would go to school and I would always volunteer to read aloud in class. And it would just be from your desk,
Yeah.
just reading from your desk, but I would go to the front of the room and volunteer to do that.
Mhm.
So it was pretty much a natural progression for me because I wanted to be able to tell compelling stories. And like you said, you want to be able to find out the who, what, where, when, and why, which, with those feature pieces is different than breaking news
Oh,
because you can really stop down, find out where they're from, find out their story, and disseminate that to an audience.
yeah.
So, I share those sentiments with you. I wouldn't have it any other way.
Yeah. And I think we all have to applaud Brian for his mic and his voice, right? So can we give some applause in the chat just for that mic right there? I can't help but stare at it, y'all. Okay, all right. So give him some applause in the chat. Continue, continue. I digress. I just can't help but stare at it. It's just
Oh no, no, this is an intimate discussion. We're supposed to have fun here.
I love it. I
Yeah, this is good stuff. It's so good to see you. But now let's one more question from the audience, and then we're going to get deep with the conversation. Okay.
okay.
What advances good journalism? Is it fact checking, editors, something else, or how do we get reliable journalism?
I think it's all of that. So
Yeah.
let's do
I,
that. So, you've got to
I,
get the basics, the fact
right.
checking, the editors. I think some of the things that do help, and we're in an age of speed, right? There's more demand on journalists, there's more speed that's required in what you're doing, how fast you can write, you can turn things. I mean, the demand is there, folks. So if you know any journalists, you should give them a pat on the back because it really is demanding. One thing that I'll say is that I think one thing we can't let go away is having a second, third eye on your scripts. Those are the things, those nuanced things that we require in the newsroom. I think we have to be mindful that those don't disappear in trying to do so much within newsrooms. The other thing that I think is extremely important is just making sure that you've covered your bases with landing all sides of things. And did you give someone fair opportunity to respond? And these are things that you learn, because look, no one walks in the door perfect. You learn. It's a very hands-on job, and you learn, and you hopefully have good mentors. But I do think it's extremely important that you are giving, if you're doing an investigative report and you're talking about a particular company or whatever it is, you give them ample time to respond. You give them ample time to respond in fairness because or you reached out multiple times through email, through phone. I just think those are the nuanced things that when you're in this digital age, that those are the things that can sometimes, slip and then cause it to have the public not trust you or the organization that you work for. So those are the things. I think it's the nuanced things, those little things that you do, and also giving journalists time, I will say, to extract and work the story more. If it's a story that lends to that, you definitely want to make sure you give them more time. And again, we are in such this age of speed. There's been a lot of cuts within journalism. Newsrooms have faced staffing situations and issues. So I think a lot of this right now is learn as you go, and everyone's figuring it out. I also think it's important, and I'll say this before I turn it to you, Brian, is that I think that sometimes we as an industry can let social media dictate too much. Letting social media dictate, who's best, or letting social media dictate the story, or the comments and all of those things that come with it, and giving too much to that sometimes. Now, sometimes, and this is where news judgment comes in, you look at that and you think, did we miss the boat because we ignored what is so obvious and everyone's calling it out? And that's great. Sometimes as journalists, you do need to be called out. We're definitely, like I said, not perfect, but sometimes on the flip side of it, from a credibility, I think you have to also have that judgment of, do we give it too much weight? So,
Yeah, there still is a traditional factor there when it comes to journalism. Of course, using if it's AP style, or again, how to project your voice, how to stand with poise on television. Of course, that's all basic pieces there. But you brought up a great point when you talk about this social media age. So many want to get it on first
mhm,
instead of trying to get it on right.
yeah.
So you brought up a great point, and I hope there's more young journalists who take heed to that, making sure that you have your fact checking, and you know you're You're ready to disseminate that, but be as credible as you possibly can by being correct. That's
Mhm, mhm.
absolutely. So let's delve a little bit deeper here. Okay, so we're almost half past, almost at the bottom of the hour. Now you have worked several places in the country.
Mm.
You've been in Memphis. You've been in both Dalton and Macon, Georgia,
Yep.
Pittsburgh. Now you're in our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. Now, you've seen a lot in your career, both on the local level and nationally. And with a small number of people of color in
Mm,
our positions as journalists, and even a smaller number in leadership positions,
mhm.
as general managers, news directors, or even owners of stations, actually. Uh, in your mind, what does a healthy media ecosystem look like to you?
Oh, where do I begin? Here's what I'll say. I think the obvious is you want staff that's diverse that can reflect different things. And by diverse, I don't limit that just to the color of our skin. I think it also matters the age, the background, the experiences they've had, because that all matters when you are discussing in your 9 a.m. meeting, oftentimes, or your 3 p.m. afternoon meeting. Folks' perspective influences decisions that are made. So having diversity across all of those, I think really matters. When I first arrived at WTAE, and I've got to give credit to management at the time, who management was changing. When I first arrived there, I was the only woman of color on air. This was not that long ago. So to be the only woman of color on air, in a top 25 market, I think, now what's beautiful is I know things have changed. And even when I was there, they were adding folks. But being the only one on camera, but then also when I walked in the newsroom and seeing that there weren't enough also in producer seats,
Sure,
there weren't enough in associate producer seats.
sure.
And so I think when we think of a healthy ecosystem, like I said, things have changed to their credit. They've made advances in hiring diverse talent, both behind the scenes and on camera. I think you have to be mindful of that, and especially now there's so many different layers to stories that aren't captured when you don't have folks who can contribute with insightful perspective into the conversation. So I think having, both in leadership, in talent, behind the scenes, even in the marketing, I think you have to be mindful of who's there. The other thing I think, particularly for Pittsburgh, that I think, and any other local market is important,
Sure.
is to recruit more local talent and try to groom them. And I know PBMF has a program every summer that helps do that. And I believe that it's either low cost or free of charge. Correct me if I'm wrong, Brian.
It
But
it is
it invites high
free of
school.
charge.
It is free of charge, right? So high school students, and I think that grooming of local talent is really important because they will more than likely stay in the communities. They will be able to contribute story ideas that reflect more people. And so all of those things help to contribute to that healthy ecosystem. And are we capturing all of the different micro communities that exist, right? So not just in Pittsburgh, I think that goes across local markets across the country. And then I think the other thing is, and this is a little bit harder for management or anyone to, I'll say, influence, is that there's implicit bias. And so if your staff doesn't have the interest in learning more about other cultures and some of the nuances and things like cultural appropriation, things, just all those different things that have come up even of late, but that have we've known for a long time. I think you have to have a staff that's either interested or aware that this is happening, and or right. Ideally, they're interested, but I'm not naive to think that everyone's interested in understanding culture and in understanding implicit bias and unconscious bias and all of those things. But I think it's really important that you at least are talking about it in an open way, and that you're allowing other voices and to contribute to the conversations that are happening in those very critical meetings that happen typically 2, 3 times a day with an entire group that dictate what the news will be for that day. And so those are some of the things that for me, I think are important when I look at different stations I've been in and things that could be improved to help create a healthy ecosystem. But it does start with leadership seeing gaps and being aware and being open that, hey, we need to make sure that our newsroom is reflective of more people.
Sure. And the program you were referring to is the Frank Bolden Urban
Thank
Multimedia Journalism Workshop.
Yes.
And it everything that you just said, you hit the nail on the head, because the reason why that program was formed over 35 years ago was for that very reason, to increase the number of Black journalists, to increase the number of not just Black journalists, but members of management, middle management, upper management, and eventually ownership.
Mhm.
Uh, in our industry, because the numbers are so small, and to be able to combat that, that's the reason. Even going back before the workshop, Pittsburgh Black Media Federation was founded in 1973. So
Mhm.
that's the reason why the organization was founded in the first place, to try to fill in some of those gaps and the implicit bias within newsrooms,
Mhm.
to be able to have a nice balance when it comes to sending any type of information to a mass audience.
Yeah, because we know, Brian, that having diverse staff, it does not stop there.
Right.
There is the inclusion piece as well. And that's just not talked about probably enough.
Right. Good point. Good
Yeah.
point. Now this goes to another point. There was a report that came out in 2019 uh,
Mhm.
by Dr. Latrell Crittenden. He's the program director and assistant professor of communication at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. He's also a former parliamentarian when he was working here in Pittsburgh,
Mhm.
former parliamentarian with the Pittsburgh Black Media Federation. Now, this underscored the lack of diversity in Pittsburgh newsrooms and in the city of Pittsburgh by saying that reporters of color here have, quote, much lesser quality of life, both inside and outside of the newsroom.
Mhm.
Now, while this problem isn't unique to Pittsburgh and can be seen across the country, could you share some ways in which you've raised awareness on this problem as being a part of the solution?
Mhm. Mhm. Oh, I think that a lot of that is true. Let me say that there. I think a lot of that is true. I think, from what I have seen, and I can speak from was not involved in that study, but from what I've seen, many of my friends that I met in Pittsburgh, and I'm grateful that I did meet them, I've become very close with them, but many of my friends who worked in journalism and are women or men of color did leave. And the what kept them there, if they stayed, was typically family, some type of tie. Maybe they went to school there and have, a huge network. But due to the lack of social spaces, and now I think it's again growing and better and expanding. But at that time, and again, I can only speak to what I saw, is that yeah, no doubt about it. It's difficult. Many ended up creating their own networks within. So for transplants, we more than likely connected with other transplants because you're not always as, I think, embraced because other folks have been there for 20 years and already have their friendships. And I think that happens in many cities. I think that that is not just a Pittsburgh thing. But I do think between the newsrooms lacking a lot of diversity and you combine that also with the lack of social spaces when folks are single and they're trying to date, let's be honest, right? They're looking at different social spaces and they say, maybe I should go to a different city. Maybe I'll have more room. And I'm just keeping it real, right? So I think that what Dr. Luttrell put out and interviewing the journalists, I think for some folks was whoa, and then for others who are in it, we're like, yeah, we can see that happening. Some of the solutions, though, because we can always talk about problems, but some of the solutions, when I think about that, is investing in organizations like PBMF, investing in PBMF, having those foundations, and then I think news organizations also looking to PBMF, not necessarily for guidance, but maybe sometimes for advice or input. So I don't mean like guidance in how to do your news every day, but maybe some input. We've
Interaction.
made some changes. We've
Sure.
made some changes lately.
Sure.
What do you all think about that? How would that resonate with you all? And I think, PBMF is so strong there, like you said, been around for what, 35 years, that it's so incredibly important that I think the community utilize PBMF as a tool, as a resource. And I think that would be something that would help with solutions. As far as diversifying and social spaces, I think that's something where you're going to have to um, bring more diverse talent in, and retention is really important, and I think that's a whole nother conversation, is then how do you retain. That relates to culture, that relates to so many it's so many different things of, well, how do you then retain once you bring the diverse talent there, because we know that there's disparities in Pittsburgh when it comes to communities of color and others, from healthcare, from pay gaps and so forth. That's not a secret.
Right.
So, I think the awareness of it, talking about it more, having those conversations, and leaning on organizations like PBMF and some others, Vibrant Pittsburgh is another, that are doing good work and can contribute to some of these spaces.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, and I'll add to that. As Pittsburgh Black Media Federation's president, I've had several conversations with Dr. Crittenden and many veteran journalists who came before me. But back to the report, it spread nationally.
Hmm.
And it clearly had an impact on industry professionals. Um, and it was the talk of newsrooms across the country, if you will,
Hmm.
not just in Pittsburgh. And I will say that this is happening, across the board. But I will say the subjects were anonymous in this piece so that they can be their true selves, and they brought to light what they said were implicit biases
Yeah.
in their newsrooms.
Yeah, because I mean, folks don't always realize, like,
Yeah.
it's difficult when you're the only one.
Yeah.
And sometimes if you don't feel you're heard, thankfully I was in positions where I do feel like my voice was heard more often than not. So I can give them, credit for that. But it doesn't, when you don't see people like you, or you don't feel embraced sometimes in certain circles within newsrooms, because newsrooms are very clicky. You can feel a bit more alone, for sure, and that can translate into you wanting to then continue and then to stay.
Yeah. And a part of that problem also is that some people don't see that as a problem.
Right.
It's
That
just
that goes back to that piece of, are folks interested in changing? Is your staff, is your leadership interested in seeing the gap, acknowledging the gap, and then changing the gap? Because if there's no interest, it's going to be an uphill battle. We know that, right? So it's
very
going to be
true. And especially because the the report itself, touched such a nerve.
yeah,
Myself, many other heads of organizations like the Pittsburgh Black Media Federation, we fielded calls and even had meetings in our respective areas on ways in newsrooms, that this can not only be addressed but rectified. And I think we're making significant pathways
yeah.
that area, because I think now more than ever, people are really starting to see that there is a problem, and willing to address it.
Hmm. Hmm.
We have another question here. This is a question to both of us. Where do you see media going in terms of making room for stories that aren't traditional, or that are from tellers who haven't been encouraged to tell their story? So I guess in other words, you know, non-traditional stories, but people who are trying to get their stories out, that they may have compelling stories, but it may not hit the air. And 9 times out of 10, it won't hit the air.
So I would tell that person, if you have something compelling, then you've got to almost put your journalism hat on, which, and I want you to contribute because you've got great insight into this too, Brian. Like, what I mean by that is, you've got to think of what's the interest value, the news value, what's either new about it. Um, because if it's only about us, then it won't relay. But if it's about having impact to others, maybe you're building something in your community, or you're starting a new organization, or whatever you might be doing that's going to have impact on others, then that becomes something where I think newsrooms will take a look. So I think from maybe the statement of the non-traditional news, they may be thinking like a feature piece. Um, and so feature pieces, I love doing them. I think sometimes we don't do enough of them because they many reasons why. But that may be, I don't want to assume, but maybe what they meant by non-traditional. But weigh in there, Brian, because I know you've got stuff to say too.
Absolutely. So, I come from traditional news, national, just like Bofta, and local. We both done national and local and international stories. But we have, I would say, a different mindset on that because we both feel as though telling those untold stories, if you will, are probably some of the most compelling stories that you'll see, even more than the ones that make the headlines.
Mhm.
So when you really think about it, with especially with the internet as strong and as vast as it is right now, and we did say something about using social media as a negative and a positive a little bit earlier, uh,
Mhm.
but using your own platform, you can build your own piece and get that out to an audience, and then news stations will see it. And if you get enough hits, and if it's like the old club promoter, right?
Mhm.
Going with flyers and putting them on cars underneath the windshield wipers while you're in the club. You come out and you see it. Oh, okay, I'm going to go to this next week,
Yeah.
right? It's almost hitting the ground running, but right there from your living room or wherever your computer's located or your phone.
Marketing yourself, extracting your own story, doing it
Telling
first.
your own piece.
Yeah.
That's very important.
Mhm.
By telling your own piece. And then you never know. I mean, it could be picked up, or you could end up being a media entity yourself where you can hire people,
Mhm. Mm.
you
How
know?
about that? How about that? I like it, next level thinking. And here's the thing, if it's something that's going to have an impact to others, believe it or not, a lot of news stations do want that.
Yeah. Right.
Unfortunately, sometimes news gets a bad rap, but the reality is oftentimes if it's something that's going to impact the whole community, we do want to know. Give us a little bit of a heads up what you're working on. Send an email. Don't hesitate to put that out there. And connecting with the journalist, speaking of social media, is not a bad idea either. So
There you go. Another question from our audience.
okay.
How has living and working in Pittsburgh contributed to both the story? And how does the same still contribute to Brian's story?
So I think this is proof of that. I'm still tied to Pittsburgh, is speaking to this fantastic audience that's been provided through Carnegie Library, and living in Highland Park, I still have connections. I'm still connected to people like Brian Cook, who leads PBMF today and does a great job. And so I still feel like Pittsburgh, although Maryland is my home. This is where I was raised. Pittsburgh still, I still have ties to it. It's an extension of my network. Just spoke to Duquesne in front of their group about a month or two ago. So I feel like tied to Pittsburgh. And I was there for almost 5 years. So, I met a lot of fantastic people doing really good things. I feel like I grew professionally there. I was promoted to weekend anchor there. I was able to do investigative reporting there. I was able to do so many things professionally, and I had a great mentor where I was able to really be in a unit with very seasoned journalists. So I became a better journalist in Pittsburgh professionally. And then personally, I just feel like I explored myself more there than any other city. And in exploring, what you realize is there's other folks who are trying to do the same thing too, or there's other ways you can tap into the next thing you're trying to do. I mentioned it earlier, but exploring coaching. I actually did therapy in Pittsburgh, and that helped, believe it or not, with story and with trying to figure out which direction I wanted to go in. And so I did a lot of reflection, in all honesty, and myself, and so personally and professionally. And then starting my business in Pittsburgh, And it was a big deal for me to do that, to start hosting workshops while I was still on air, and then deciding to not re-sign a contract and take a big risk, and be fortunate to be in a position to turn down a contract and leave on my own terms, and then to start my own business and move into that direction and really take it to where it is now. And I spoke more in Pittsburgh than I did any other city. So many different things for me. Pittsburgh is a part of my story and cultivated and helped me in becoming who I am now. And I still feel like, y'all, I'm just starting. I really feel like I'm, in a journey that's just ongoing. I'm starting this or I start that. So it's just continuous. But Pittsburgh certainly professionally and personally was very huge for me in so many ways, and I did not know that going there. I did not know
Right.
what to expect, and just been blessed. I feel like I've been very blessed.
Yes. In Pittsburgh, I love Pittsburgh, and being a native, um, it's only 60, a little shy of 60 square miles, and then there's, it's very easy to navigate. You can, it's like
Mhm.
Cheers, everybody knows your name. So, I know a lot of people in the city. I'm a native Pittsburgher, like I said, I know the area. But most importantly, I know the stories that aren't being told, like we just said, and should be. So, the people who are doing amazing things here in Western Pennsylvania or Pittsburgh, and just being able to tell those compelling stories and about people in my hometown who wouldn't otherwise be featured. And then, my family, of course, who I've known my whole life, they can see me on television programs here in Pittsburgh or hear me on the radio. That's a beautiful thing. So it's a beautiful part of being a part of that fabric here in Pittsburgh. And last but not least, it's great to be able to cover the Pittsburgh Steelers. Born and raised. Hey, I mean,
I
I'm
knew you're gonna say that. I knew you're gonna say it. You get a front row
a
seat
fan.
every
I'm
time with that camera.
non-biased. I'm non-biased. Okay, so
That camera gets you in every time.
right, right, right.
Mhm.
We have a couple more.
I
How
love it. Hit me
how
with
often? Oh, this is a good one. How often do TV broadcasters write their own content these days?
such a good, such a good question. uh, TV broadcasters, I'm gonna split it up. You've got anchors who are doing a beastly half hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, 4 hour show sometimes, and so naturally they're not writing all of that. But what they are doing is they usually have a producer. Producer does a lot of writing for that anchor and for the show and lining up things. But the anchor, really good anchors, treat it just like anything else. They're going to go behind and they're going to look at how it's written and they're going to ask good questions and they're going to evaluate, the different scripts. On a reporter's side, I know in some organizations you do have producers who are heavily involved in writing. I write my own stories. So I can't speak for all organizations or for all journalists, but I do write my own stories. And I even write oftentimes what the anchor's going to say because I know the whole story. So I say what they're going to say. I know the lead, I know the hook. And then I move into my piece, what I'm going to say, go into the story, et cetera, et cetera. So oftentimes I might even, write the anchor question. Why? Because I know the story. They're looking at an hour, 2 hour show. I know my piece, right? So I help them out by writing that. And typically, since I'm on the ground doing that, I'm going to come up with a probably a better question because I just know the story in and out, more so than the anchor who has a 2, 3 hour, 4 hour beast to go through. I hope
Absolutely.
that answers your question.
Yeah, that was a great answer. So we are roughly 9 minutes until the top of the hour.
I love how you keep us on track, just like in the broadcast world. You're
What we
so
do.
on it.
That's
I don't mind going a few minutes over if we got some good questions coming in. So
right,
I'm
right.
happy to do that and hang out with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's why we get along. We're on the same wavelength. We speak the same language, both.
Keep the same way.
Let me ask you this question. And this is something that we talked about at the beginning, and you and I have talked about several times in the past. It was about telling some international stories and bringing some of those international stories to light here in the U.S.
Mhm.
Many times you're not going to be able to get those stories like PBMF. We try to do a story every 2 years where we go to I won't say remote places, but destinations, outside of the United States to try to tell stories. In 2015, we went to Paris. 2017, we went to Cuba. We were planning a trip to Morocco,
Mhm.
and then we want to be able to get to at least one or two countries in Africa, and then go some other places. But just talk about why it's good to tell stories internationally, especially to show people of color in a positive light. Try to combat some of the images that we see from other countries here
Mhm.
in this land.
I think anytime you can show different perspectives that invite people to have deeper, more rich and insightful conversations, I think that that's always going to be something that benefits us as a society. Oftentimes, we see ourselves as separate from another country, but we all are humans, and I think humanizing stories, which is what journalism, that's what we do, humanizing it, going to that person and showcasing what they're going through may not be so different, or the emotions that they're going through may not be so different than what you or somebody is experiencing here, and that we're all really connected. We really are. And I think oftentimes we also just see such a difference in how people respond to international reporting sometimes, and that they see it as so distant. It's like it's happening all the way out there. It's not affecting us. But you know what it is? It's all coming full circle. And so I look forward to doing more of that. I now am working with the Black News Channel, where we predominantly cover those stories that are communities of color. And so I look forward to making more of those connections. And once we really are traveling more, being able to connect some of those stories. I mean, we went to Cuba, but why the hook there too was that the relationship that Cuba and Pittsburgh had, even before, 3, 4 decades ago, and how that was a friendship and a relationship, and that it used to be, I think, the number one destination for Pittsburghers way long ago. So there was just this whole sister city component, and we were weaving that in together, and how it helped even from an educational standpoint, University of Pittsburgh having that early program of studying abroad in Cuba before many other universities. And so, when you can connect and find out more information, and that goes back to, right, knowing the community, speaking to people, understanding, the different layers within various communities, and doing that in a way where then you say, oh, I think that's a story idea. Maybe we could do that. And I was at the airport traveling a week ago, and I was literally standing next to a pilot while we were both waiting for the food line. And in speaking to him, I'm talking. I tell him I'm a journalist, and we're talking, and a story idea comes, and that's just talking to people and having conversations, and understanding that, look, everyone has these different titles, but we are all just human beings. We've got two legs, and we put our pants on the same way every morning. So look, just understanding that we're all human, no matter where we are in different parts of the world, and that those titles and all those things go out the door when you're talking about emotions and real stories. So
Yeah. And we can get one more in.
mhm,
Um,
love it.
and it's a question for both of us.
Okay,
What is your favorite story or topic you've ever covered?
that's hard to say.
I can go
Okay,
first
keep
if you
going. Go ahead.
want. All right. I'll say this, I mentioned I was joking about the Pittsburgh Steelers a little earlier, right? But I was covering practice and going to practice and going in the locker room, getting some sound and taking it back to the newsroom. But I wasn't going to the games at that point. But the first game, not even a regular season, not a preseason, not a the first game that I ever covered was Super Bowl 40 in Detroit. The Steelers and the Seahawks. So I will say that that's my second favorite story, but I had to mention that because we were joking about the Steelers a little
Yeah,
earlier and
yeah,
the love.
amazing that that was your first like
First
real
actual game.
game.
Crazy, right? Crazy, crazy. But I will say this: my favorite story, and it's so hard because we've been in the business long enough. It's so hard to just pick one. But I'm gonna tell you why this is my favorite. So I covered the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial from the beginning until it was erected right there in Washington D.C.
Hmm.
And the impact on the country, that it had, and well, let's go back. The impact that Dr. King had on this country and the world, but the impact that the memorial had on this country and in the world was second to none. And Dr. King actually is historic in several phases because Dr. King has the last available space on the National Mall. There can be no more monuments on the National Mall. Okay. But I interviewed his children, Martin Luther King III, Dr. Bernice King, so many dignitaries and politicians. But the one interview that I did that really, still touches me to this day was the late Congressman John Lewis,
Oh, wow.
who was a teenager when Dr. King was going through the civil rights movement. And we were talking about how important this is. And we started getting deep in the conversation. And then I asked him, just talk about how sad people were when Dr. King was assassinated. And then he and I both got emotional on the phone. He's the only person that ever made me cry.
Wow.
Um,
I've
at,
cried a bunch of times.
yeah, yeah.
Clean it up. I've had to brush some mascara away on air. Yeah. Wow. That's the only time. I'm impressed
It was-
with
I've,
that.
yeah, I've gotten choked up a few times. I've covered some hard stories, but I mean, full tears and everything. He was a great man, and again, being non-biased here, but just being honest.
Yeah.
His impact on the world. If he wasn't here, we would probably not be able to be in this industry and or to be having this conversation right now.
Yeah. Change agent for sure. Just folks who are, like the legacy still continues.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
there's a bill right now in Congress
Yeah.
named after him trying to get through. Related to voting. So that's an incredible experience. I don't know if I can top that, y'all. No. Um, Here's what I'll say is that I think I have stories that stand out to me. I don't know if I would say a favorite. I've covered some cool things and I've interviewed some cool people, even just last week. So one story that you know for me, I think somebody had asked this as one of the questions, but just telling those untold stories. And I think one story I did in Pittsburgh, again, from having a conversation. This time I was having a conversation in the car with a photographer, as we often do as reporters, just chatting. And it was related to Johnny Gamage, and it was when everything was happening in New York, and the "I Can't Breathe," and just connecting the two incidents. And I know we're short on time, so I won't go into all the details. But I actually, and this is where I can say that when I did speak up about certain stories, I do think TA did, back me on some of them. And I said, well, I just heard about Johnny Gamage. And I, again, not being local, did not know of Johnny Gamage's story. And they said, well, if you can find family members who are willing to speak, just so happens they were in Florida, his parents. So we flew out to Florida, and interviewed his parents, and ended up turning a 3-part series, relating Johnny Gamage and the fact that there were no cameras at that time, and he was a black man that was pulled over, and what happened with the officers at that time, and all of those things. And again, I don't want to go into too many details because we are going to wrap up here, but connecting that story with what was happening in present day, from technology and cameras and being able to film things, and then what was alleged at that time, but there was no camera. And just the tragedy of it all, the sadness of it all, but also the question of, did he die in vain? And his parents, and having that one-on-one interview with them, and they were amazing. And I look back on that, and I really do think that's one of the stories that I'm really proud of, because I don't think if I had mentioned it, it may have been covered or covered in that way. And it kind of tears me up even thinking about it, because I just remember the look on his parents' face and what they went through, and how they moved to Florida after the trial. And just, it was so tough for them. And that was their only son, who lost his life. And so that those kinds of stories stay with you. I think those kinds of stories stay with you. And again, it happened organically in a conversation where the photographer said, it kind of reminds me of Johnny Gamage. And I was like, who's Johnny Gamage again? And through that, then pitching the idea, flying to Florida, creating a series out of it, and hopefully bringing awareness to how times have changed, and so many other things related to people of color and inequality, and justice. Um, so that's a story that certainly stands out when I think of one off the top of my head. Another one I did in Memphis, a story of redemption related to another woman. So there are stories that just stay with you, and I think when you cover literally hundreds of stories over the years, um, a few stay with you, and I think oftentimes it's the connection, or who you interviewed sometimes, that it lands with you, just like Brian just mentioned a second ago. It's just that moment that your goal is to share inaccuracy, right? Is to share what the story is, and it's such an honor to be invited into someone's home, and I don't take that lightly, to share their story, to share their son's story. And I think that's just a tremendous amount of responsibility that is critical. Social media, digital aid, doesn't matter, whether it's 20 years ago or now. That sense of responsibility, I think, is really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're going to take one last question. Uh,
Okay.
and this is from a person that I really respect and love in this industry. And it is from Manette Seat, WQED. She says, so impressed to see and hear you both. Now, after the past year, what keeps you moving forward?
Well, great question.
Yeah,
Great question. And I will say that I'm very hopeful. What keeps me, I think, personally and professionally, moving forward in all ways, and I do have different things going on, and I have a business and do the journalism and do different things, and I feel very hopeful, um, hopeful for coming through what we've all been through, a pandemic, um, and that there's light at the end of the tunnel. I think we're starting to see a glimpse of that. It's certainly not over by any means, any stretch, particularly for communities of color. Um, but I just think that I'm hopeful, and I think that's what I have to be honest. I have to be hopeful because I'm tasked with the responsibility of going out there and interviewing and sharing the stories of people who are change agents, or the people who are not being heard. And so I've got to be hopeful going into the day, because I don't know what I will be, so to speak, facing or reporting. And then, as a business owner, as a minority-owned business, as a woman-owned business, I think you have to be positive, right? Because you just have to see things in that light. Otherwise, who knows, how you'll start to operate, and that could change everything. So I feel hopeful. If that's the first thing. And I thank you for that question, because it does make me really reflect. But that is something that I really feel. And I also will say that in 2018, when I left Pittsburgh, and I'll just touch on this, a couple of things were happening at that time where, my contract was up. I was deciding not to resign. I wanted to just really try this business thing, and see where it would go. I was willing to walk away from, like, safety net, so to speak. And at the same time, my dad, we found out that same month, so crazy how God works, that same month we found out my father was terminally ill. And so when I moved back to DC, it was a very chaotic time. I was not only moving, I decided, and I'm honored that I was able to care for my father during his last chapter, but it was emotionally taxing. It was so much. And so I had to have so much hope. So when the pandemic came around, right? I knew what that was like, to kind of tap back into, what, I've got to be hopeful. I cannot let everything happening around me just pull me down. I've got to remain hopeful. I have too much responsibility. And so I still feel like that's carried on for me. And I've been blessed in that way. Also got married during the pandemic, that's hope too, right? You walk down the aisle, it's in hope. Hope everything's gonna work out. So
That's what I'm talking about.
on a light note, right? But so hopeful. I don't Brian, and you?
Yeah. I mean, you know what? I'll say this. That was a great point about the pandemic. But when we were, going through the pandemic and when it really started to intensify, we were hearing about the quote unquote essential workers. So the doctors, the police officers, EMS, people who worked in grocery stores, and you have to wear your mask, and you never really heard, hey, the journalists are essential workers as well.
Mm.
But in my mind, I said, I am an essential worker. So
Mhm.
I'm going to continue. I didn't skip a beat. I was coming back off of an international trip from Costa Rica, Belize, and Panama, and then coming back to the United States, and then continuing to do stories right around the beginning of March. So what kept me going is really trying to stay optimistic,
Mhm.
smile more than frown, and try to do as many compelling stories as possible. Try to interview people. How is the pandemic affecting people? Or, trying to give some people some sense of normalcy with some of those pieces.
Mm.
So, that was my way of, trying to keep my mental sanity, to try to continue working and not go into full seclusion, from the rest of the world, and continue to say, all right, well, there are no buses out here. The grocery store is a ghost town. But then again, keeping that optimistic look and watching it gradually get back to this point. And we're not out of the woods yet, but we're getting back to the point where we once were a couple years ago. So, my profession is what kept me moving forward and saying I want to make sure that I can do my part to keep other people, in tune with what's going on around them.
I love that. I think that that's powerful, and storytelling can be therapeutic.
Yes,
Let people know they're not alone, and you do that so well.
absolutely. Any final thoughts, both?
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. Like I said at the very beginning, I think before we even came on, I feel like I'm just hanging out with a friend. Just happens to be, folks on the call with us, right? But I feel, I will say this, I feel incredibly fortunate um, to be in a position where I took risks and I was willing to really I took a tremendous amount of risks at different time, and I feel fortunate that I was given the gumption to persist when there were a lot of things that could have gotten in the way and roadblocks and so forth. And so I thank God for that. And that I was able to create my own economy. So when the pandemic hit, I did feel like, well, I know how to create my own economy. So if things, completely belly under, I will find a way. And so I was able to help others during the pandemic also do the same thing and help them create their own economy while still, I was at the time freelancing for CBS. And so I feel incredibly blessed that I took those risks when I did because it was the right time.
Sure.
And so the one thing I would say to people is don't be afraid, even if you feel like you don't have it, to invest in yourself. Because at the end of the day, you want to be able to look back and know that you tried, whatever it is, whether you want to become a jewelry maker, whether you want to become a photographer, whatever it might be, dabble, and go for it. Because I really do believe we have multi-dimensional gifts and talents, and they've been placed inside of you. And it's on you to figure out the way to let those things soar. And again, I'm still figuring a lot of things out, right? As you go to different levels and try different things. I'll never say I haven't figured out, and I love the challenge of it all. And I just encourage people who are listening and who want to do those things to find somebody 5 steps ahead of you and see if you can mentor or coach with them in whatever respect it is, whether you want to enter journalism or whatever it is. I really believe in pouring into yourself, and I attribute that to a lot of what helped me get to this moment in time. And so, with that said, I again feel grateful to Carnegie Library for even reaching out and inviting me here to speak with Brian in this really amazing space. And I think these are the kinds of spaces that we need more of. And so, I just want to applaud them for just coming up with the idea of this series and wanting to have these conversations. And so, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you to everyone who took the time to attend because I know y'all are busy and Zoom has been the thing for the past year.
Yes, yes, it has. Yes, it has. You're such an amazing person, both. Thank you so much for having this conversation. Absolutely. Special thanks to the Carnegie Library and all of the sponsors for having us for the Power of Story and Representation, a part of the Civic CLP Speaker Series for both the Yimam. I'm Brian Cook, and thank you all for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the series.